Okay. Good evening, everybody. Before we get started, I want to thank Michelle and the board for the opportunity tonight to share some of my experiences with you on centering prayer. And we can start with how did I find centering prayer initially? Like many of you, I began meditation in the 1980s and at a very difficult time with intrusive thoughts. I guess you can call it the monkey mind. I was never able to really solve that problem, and they followed me around for a lot of years of meditation. So a few years ago, while studying the cloud of unknowing, I encountered centering prayer, which made a lot of sense to me. After reading a few books, some e-courses, and the most important thing, establishing a daily practice, centering prayer trained me how to manage thoughts. So Father Thomas Keaton, the founder of centering prayer, he tells us, having thoughts is not a problem. Thinking about them is. So centering prayer doesn't try to prevent thoughts as some of the other meditation practices do. It focuses on not engaging with them. So tonight we'll explore centering prayer. It's a connection to Christian contemplation. If time permits, we can have a brief meditation. I've got about 30 slides, and I'm going to begin by providing a background and some of the basis for centering prayer. So first is the origin of centering prayer. And with respect to the slides, every time you see a blue background, that's a quote. A lot of the quotes are from Father Thomas Keating. And the primary words will be colored in blue. So centering prayer is a method of silent, wordless prayer that comes out of the Christian contemplative tradition. The practice is primarily based on the teaching of a classic spiritual text from the 14th century, the Cloud of Unknowing. Its primary effect is in transforming the structure of inner consciousness, so that centering prayer is going to be focusing on transformation. Next is the need for centering prayer. There we go. The method of centering prayer is a contemporary invitation to present the teaching of an earlier time in an updated format, and to make it available to ordinary people who are experiencing a hunger for a deeper spirituality, a prayerful life, and a support system to sustain it. So it's not a new method of praying, it's just an updated format for current times and needs. Some of the basic forms of Christian prayer. So prayer in Christianity is the tradition of communication with God. It has a three-stage hierarchy. First is vocal prayer, including Lectio Divina, or divine reading, the Jesus prayer, and the rosary. Second, Christian meditation with focused attention. And finally, contemplative prayer, which aims to achieve a spiritual union with God. And make a few comments about traditional meditation now, because we're going to be comparing centering prayer to that in the future, and we want to, so we can see the differences. So traditional meditation is dual mode, and it tries to obtain external silence, i.e. a subject, yourself, and some object. I used to follow the breath when I meditated. Some people use a candle, a mantra. In there, our attention is what connects the subject to the object. And that starts the flow of mental energy. There's a saying that goes, energy flows where the attention goes. So the minute that attention makes that connection, mental energy starts flowing out of the body towards the object. And if you remain quiet, one can sense the movement of this energy. Centering prayer, on the other hand, doesn't use attention. Consequently, energy does not leave the body and flow outwards towards the object of attention. Instead, that energy is available for transformation as you move towards interior silence. Contemplative prayer, or union with God. In the Christian tradition, contemplative prayer is considered to be the pure gift of God. It's the opening of mind and heart, our whole being, to God, the ultimate mystery, beyond thoughts, words, and emotions. Through grace, we open our awareness to God. And here we have the development beyond the lower personality or kama manas to a heart-mind cognition, buddhi manas. Contemplative prayer in Theosophy, and I got some quotes from Annie Besant. So in the first stage, the seat of self-consciousness is moved from the lower mind to the higher by strenuous thinking, by the intellectual travail of the student, the philosopher, the man of science. And as strenuous thinking can alone lift the seat of self-consciousness from the mind to the intellect, so can deep concentration and meditation alone raise that seat from the intellect to the spirit. So this is Theosophy's Manas Taijasis, and in Pablo Sender's book, The Evolution of the Higher Consciousness, he really does a nice job of discussing this topic. It's one we studied a couple of years ago, and as Annie Besant said, there are two stages where the lower mind is communicating with and receiving communication from the higher mind through the Antakarana. That's done by strenuous thinking, something like studying a secret doctrine. And the second stage is the higher mind is in communication with buddhi. So from the life of the lower mind, man rises to the life of the intellect, using abstract thinking, universal principles. From the life of the intellect, man rises to the life of the spirit. And I remember back in the 1980s, I was studying my first correspondence course on Dion Fortune's Cosmic Doctrine, and reading a little bit about how difficult it was to study metaphysics. And I was thinking, I had 10 years of engineering school, 6 years of graduate mathematics, so I'll be able to handle this. So I started reading that book, and I hate to admit it, but I'd get through a page or a half a page, and my mind just couldn't wrap itself around the strenuous thinking. It would just freeze and lock up. It took me the better part of a year to get through that book. And I didn't have a really good understanding of the big picture at that time. It was the first time I was coming in contact with that type of approach, but it's very true. And even when I think of the secret doctrine, on some levels, it builds our inner strength, builds that connection between the lower and the higher mind by forcing us to be very strenuous. So centering prayer is a method designed to facilitate the development of contemplative prayer by preparing our faculties to receive this gift. So it's not a form of contemplative prayer, it's just getting our faculties ready to go into that level. And basically, the method of centering prayer consists in learning to withdraw our attention from thoughts. In fact, the Father has told us that he actually likes thoughts. The more thoughts that enter your mind, every time you don't engage with them, you're coming closer to God. You're going through an exercise that brings you closer. So thoughts are welcomed in centering prayer. And with respect to Christian contemplation, we can think of three levels. First, we have to deal with external silence, then internal silence, and then contemplation or union with God. We mentioned before that traditional meditation deals with attention, whereas centering prayer deals with intention. So unlike meditation, centering prayer does not furnish an object for your attention. There is no subject-object mode. Instead, you just withdraw your attention from anything that brings it to a focal point and return again and again to your underlying intention to be deeply open to God. And this step here involves what the use of a sacred word. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The essence of this method lies in the prompt releasing of thoughts, not in stopping them from arising in the first place. And after a while, this develops a detached attitude towards them. Ultimately, one develops a state of interior silence. Some basic terms, some terminology for centering prayer. So attention, the focusing on a particular object such as the breath, and when that connection is made between subject and object, then the mental energy starts to flow. Awareness, another term for consciousness. Intention, the choice of the will in regard to some goal or purpose. Interior silence, the quieting of the imagination, feelings, and rational faculties. Mysticism, a synonym for contemplation. And thoughts. Thoughts is an umbrella term for any perception at all, including sense perceptions, feelings, images, memories, reflections, or commentaries. So this is St. Joseph's Abbey in Spencer, Mass. That was the birthplace of centering prayer. I live in Western Mass. So this is about an hour and a half ride from my house. And I've been here many times. Before I even discovered centering prayer, I had a connection with this particular facility, this particular monastery. So the Trappist monks at the monastery, both male and female, and I love their dress, the robes. This is the monks chanting in the Abbey chapel, and it's all stone. And back in the 80s, they used to sell cassette tapes that recorded the sound in here almost exactly as if you're in there, especially during the Christmas season. I'd go up there quite a few times to listen to them chant, and it was beautiful. There we go. The library. Beautiful picture of the sunlight coming in. So now some history of centering prayer. So Father Thomas Keating was the abbot of St. Joseph's Trappist Monastery in Spencer, Mass. In 1971, he attended a meeting in Rome with Pope Paul III, asking the members of the clergy to revive the contemplative dimension of the gospel, in the lives of monastic and lay people. Returning home, the abbot encouraged the monks to develop a method of Christian contemplative prayer with the same appeal and accessibility that Eastern meditation practices seem to have for modern people. And at this time, the Christian church was losing a lot of members to the Eastern meditation practices. I think if you remember, in 1967, the Beatles first went to the Indian guru Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And Father William Mettinger, he found the background for such a method in the anonymous 14th century classic, The Cloud of Unknowing. And he developed a simple method of silent prayer, originally called the Prayer of the Cloud.
Did you mean Pope Paul VI?
No, unless I made a typo. I have it as Pope Paul IV. I can check that. Thank you.
Or he was the second, I think.
Pope Paul VI was different from Pope John Paul.
John Paul II.
John Paul I and John Paul II. But I think in 71, it must have been Pope Paul VI.
Okay, and maybe I could have just reversed the letters. That makes sense.
Yeah, Paul VI.
Thank you. So this is Father Thomas Keating, of course, with the Dalai Lama. And he was the founder of centering prayer. This was his initial book on centering prayer in 1986, Open Mind, Open Heart, the Contemplative Dimension of the Gospel. This is Father William A. Mettinger. All right, he was the second founder of centering prayer. One of his books contemplative prayer in the cloud of unknowing, the loving search for God. And the third founder, Father M. Basil Pennington. Now, I had spent 30 years in Western Massachusetts as a student of a monastic-based form of Okinawan karate. My sensei or teacher was a part-time student at the monastery at that time under Father Pennington, who was a spiritual advisor. And I remember for about 10 years, we would get a call from sensei. He'd call up the black belts and we'd have to go pick him up and bring him to the monastery and drop him off. He'd tell us that he's never coming home again and for us to continue to run the dojo. And after a few days, we get another call for us to go pick him up and bring him back. He loved the dojo and he couldn't live without it. And this went on for years. So finally, he ultimately left the monastery and he focused on just teaching a monastic-based form of martial arts in Western Mass. So he did two things really well. He was really good at praying, and he really loved martial arts, and that's all he did in his life. So, but that's where my history is. So this is one of his books on centering prayer, Renewing an Ancient Christian Prayer Form. So now the growth of centering prayer. So Fathers Thomas Keaton, Menninger, and Pennington began to offer instruction on the prayer of the cloud to visiting clergy who came to the monastery for retreats. Workshops for the lay people in the Spencer community and retreats away from St. Joseph's. At one of the retreats, someone suggested changing the name to centering prayer, prayer which is centered entirely on the presence of God. In 1981, Father Keaton moved to St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass, Colorado, to focus totally on centering prayer. In '83, he gave the first intensive centering prayer retreat at the Lama Foundation in New Mexico. And in 1986, the Three Monks Experiment was incorporated as Contemplative Outreach Limited. So this is Father Thomas Keating giving one of the original Contemplative Outreach seminars. Did that for many, many years. Now we get into the cloud of unknowing. In this particular version, I'm going to reference is Carmen Acevedo's Butcher's translation. In chapter 7 of the cloud of unknowing, which is called How to Deal with Your Thoughts during contemplative prayer, especially when curiosity and natural intelligence intrude. This is considered the most familiar chapter in the cloud as it furnished the direct source for centering prayer. Paragraph 5 was used by Father William Menninger as the building block that would become the cornerstone of centering prayer. So the first 4 paragraphs present a dramatic dialogue between the seeker and a pesky thought intent on derailing him. So this is chapter 7, paragraph 5. It deals with centering prayer's sacred word. If you want to gather this focus into one word, making it easier to grasp, select a little word of one syllable, not 2. The shorter the word, the more it helps the work of the Spirit. God or love works well. Pick one of these or any other words you like. And as long as it is one syllable, fasten it to your heart. Fix your mind on it permanently, so nothing can dislodge it. And he was really very focused on no words except the words that were of one syllable. And they didn't have to have a sacred connotation. I mean, you didn't have to pick God or spirit. It's a word that meant something to you. For instance, my sacred word was bye, B-Y-E, because I wanted to use that word to say goodbye to pesky thoughts. All right. And that worked for me very well. The reason it's termed sacred is because it represents your intention to move closer to God. So chapter 7, paragraph 6 clarifies 5. And the part I want to talk about is really what's in blue. Anonymous tells us that this word will protect you. It will be your shield and spear. It will knock down every thought. When you think about that a little bit, you know, a shield and a spear protects a warrior from an attack by the enemy, similar to the way that the sacred word works. You know, the sacred word acts as somewhat of a shield and a spear. Prevents the enemy, your thoughts, from reaching the warrior or the lower mind. And after you practice this a while, that's exactly what it does. It deflects the thoughts from making the connection with your lower mind. Father Keating speaks on the sacred word. He says, the sacred word helps us to let go of our thoughts. Its purpose is not to stop our thoughts, but to remind us to detach from them. You can also think of the sacred word, that it's acting as a tether for one's attention, around which the thoughts may come and go. Father also has some other comments on the thoughts. The sacred word is a method of letting go of all thoughts. Thoughts have emotional charges or energy attached to them. Having thoughts is not a problem. Thinking about them is. To be aware of thoughts is not necessarily to be engaged with thoughts. Centering prayer is not the absence of thoughts, but detachment from them. All thoughts that come down the inner stream of consciousness are subject to time because they are moving objects, and every object has to go by. And this, I know this one is very true. The imagination is a perpetual motion machine, constantly producing images and thoughts. What happens is, as a thought, at least my direct experience has been, when you're meditating, as a thought starts to approach your mind, as a thought starts to approach your attention, you just slowly introduce quietly the sacred word. And after a while, your mind doesn't get doesn't focus on that thought at all. It learns it as a technique. And the thought deflects, the sacred word deflects the thought from making an attachment to you. So this is just a reading from Father Keating on the inner stream of consciousness. What he says is, in centering prayer, we withdraw our attention from the ordinary flow of thoughts. We tend to identify ourselves with that flow. But there is a deeper part of ourselves, the spiritual level. Centering prayer opens our awareness to this deep level of our being that might be compared to a stream or river on which our memories, images, feelings, inner experiences, the awareness of outward things are all resting. Many people are so identified with the ordinary flow of their thoughts and feelings that they are not aware of the source from which these mental objects are emerging. Like boats or debris floating along the surface of a river, our thoughts and feelings must be resting on something. This something is the inner stream of consciousness, which is our participation in God's being. We want to just let what's floating on the water pass by and stay engaged with that, the act of what the river is doing. So now a little comparison between contemplative and centering prayers. Contemplative and centering prayer, how are they different? Contemplative prayer is a process of interior transformation. A conversation initiated by God and leading, if we consent to, divine union. A restructuring of consciousness takes place. Centering prayer prepares one for contemplation. Its primary scriptural basis is Jesus's wisdom saying in Matthew 6.6. So in Matthew 6.6, when you pray, go to your inner room, close the door, and pray to your Father in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. This is just a short video that we're not going to look at tonight. But Matthew 6.6 describes 3 movements into deeper degrees of silence. The first, go to your inner room, is the spiritual level of our being, leaving ordinary psychological awareness, i.e. external silence. Second level, close the door. You want to stop the internal dialogue and find that interior silence. The third level, pray to your Father in secret, is divine union with God as he is, not as we think he is. So the first 2 steps are what centering prayer focuses on. And of course, the third step is divine union with God. So Clara Codd comments on Matthew 6.6, clarifying the little room as the chamber of the heart chakra. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet or little room. And when thou hast shut the door, cease to respond to outer thoughts. Pray to thy Father. Our higher self is often called our Father in heaven, which is in secret. And thy Father, which seeth in secret, shall reward thee openly. Visible and tangible response. In that same book, that's from the Techniques of the Spiritual Life, HPV also comments on this Matthew 6.6. She says, the mind and the heart are the 2 wings by which man flies to heaven. The mind is the form builder. The heart is the life giver. HPB writes, the heart is the king, the most important organ in the body of man. The heart is the center of spiritual consciousness, as the brain is the center of intellectual. But this consciousness cannot be guided by a person, nor its energy directed by him, until he is at one with Buddhi Manas, the higher spiritual counterparts. Until then, it guides him, if it can. Hence the pangs of remorse, the pricklings of conscience. They come from the heart, not from the head. The psycho-intellectual man is all in the head with its 7 gateways. The spiritual man is in the heart. The Taittiriya Upanishads also comments on the chamber inside the heart. That which is the bright space within the heart, in that this man resides, innate with mind, transcending death, with brilliancy innate. In Greek mysticism, it was thought of as a violet flame within the chamber of the heart. It is well to remember that it is not the physical heart which is meant, but that shining golden chakra which is situated between the shoulder blades, but slightly outside the body, a little to the right. Meditation sometimes produces a glow there. So also does high and pure emotion. But given that background, these are the 4 guidelines for centering prayer. So first, you're going to choose a sacred word as the symbol of your intention to consent to God's presence and action within. Remember, that needs to be 1 syllable. Sitting comfortably and with eyes closed, you're going to settle briefly and silently introduce the sacred word as a symbol of your consent to God's presence and action within. When engaged with your thoughts, return ever so gently to the sacred word. At the end of the prayer period, remain in silence with eyes closed for a couple of minutes. So when a thought begins to arise, don't let the mind connect to it. Don't let your attention connect to it. Instead, go to your sacred word. And after a while, your sacred word will deflect the thought. It won't allow your attention to connect subject to object. You won't sense a leaving of mental energy from your body. You'll find that that stays in the body and it's available for moving towards interior silence. I think we've got time. Yeah. So why don't we try that? Okay. Oops. Let me go back here. So again, choose a sacred word, one syllable. Let's get comfortable with your eyes closed. Settle briefly down into your center. And it's okay to let thoughts come into your mind. Just don't connect with them. As they move towards you, introduce your sacred word. So when you're ready, let's return quietly. It's a total different approach, especially if you've been meditating in a certain way for many years. You know, it took me about 9 months to a year for it to really work. But I'll say that since that time, I've never had a problem with intrusive thoughts. I stay calm, much calmer in my meditation. I actually I welcome thoughts because I know that every time I introduce the sacred word, I'm moving closer to God, my intention. So this may not be for everyone, but I will say that it does work. And if you're being bothered by those pesky thoughts, I think it's worth a try. There are quite a few books out on it, and on Contemplative Prayer website, they have e-courses, and they've got quite a movement, a few 100,000 participants worldwide. So thank you. And now we can, do you have some questions? And Pablo, thank you for the opportunity to share tonight.
Sure.
Thanks for this,
Sure.
Doug. This was really nice.
Yeah, very nice.
And, you know, I'm actually, when I was living in Chicago, I actually attended the Chicago Contemplative group out there, and got introduced to Christina Bajolt's work.
Yes, yeah, yes.
So,
I like her a lot.
yeah, yeah. So I love her work on Mary Magdalene.
Yeah. And she really wrote a couple of nice books on the cloud and her interpretation, and also from a psychological basis, which really helped me to understand it better. I mean, there's a lot to understand in that book, but it pointed the right direction for me, because when I first started, you know, it takes a while to recognize what they're trying to say. Yeah, she's one of my favorites. She's very busy. I mean, she's involved in so many spiritual efforts.
Yeah, yeah. She actually it was very interesting because they had a break when she did her presentation, and they had lunch, and she was sitting at this table, and I kind of wanted to walk away and not sit near her because I was feeling a little intimidated. And she looked straight at me and she said, "There's a seat right here." And, you know, and then that was it. That was the end of the ice and everything else. She's so approachable. She's so very, very kind. And she knew all about theosophy. So.
What year was that?
This was just like a couple of years ago. It wasn't very long ago.
Yeah.
So I really liked her. I loved her presentation as well. I loved her program. Lots of singing. So.
Anybody want to share their secret word? I know secret kind of suggests that you're not supposed to tell, but I was just curious. You know, I took a very functional word.
Yeah.
Because I'm, you know, saying goodbye to thoughts. That being an engineer or having engineering training, you know, that kind of typifies my thinking. But I'm just curious.
I used the word still for stillness, you know, still.
Yeah. No, that's a good one. That's right. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Doug.
Yes, sir. Oh, excuse me. Dana used the word shield so that it would deflect the thought. Yes, Jerry.
Can you say more about how the relationship between this practice of centering prayer and the mystic text Cloud of the Unknowing? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, the Cloud of Unknowing, as we know, is focused towards contemplation. And centering prayer is focused, at least in Christian mysticism, towards the first two levels of achieving external silence and then moving towards internal silence. I mean, once it goes past internal silence, we're talking about something that we can't talk about. But the only real connection from what's written in the contemplative prayer text is that one paragraph with that one word, that was interpreted as the vehicle for achieving interior silence. Now, when I first read The Cloud of Unknowing, I did not interpret the use of the sacred word the way that contemplative prayer does. I guess I just didn't read it deep enough. So I do think that from that standpoint, it helps you to understand what Anonymous was, I believe, alluding to and what he was trying to get us to do. Does that make sense, Jerry? It's
Yeah, I
he-
remember. Go ahead.
ahead,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. You were saying?
No, I was just saying thank you. And I had remembered reading The Cloud of Unknowing in college, and knowing that you were going to do this, I had picked it up today. And there's a lot of doctrine in it. I mean, there's an awful lot of philosophy and doctrine in The Cloud of Unknowing. So I just found it interesting that it was the source of this, an inspiration behind this particular practice.
In the cloud, like the main exercise is the contemplative prayer, where he says, leave all thoughts behind in a cloud of forgetting, plant your awareness or your consciousness in the cloud of unknowing with no thoughts, no memories, only love for God, no prayers, nothing. But later in the book, he says, if you can't quite do that, then you can start this way. And then there is the quote that Doug brought, choose a small word and repeat it. So in the cloud of unknowing, this centering prayer is a preliminary exercise, as Doug explained, that will lead to this completely silent contemplation. So I guess all these people were, all these monks were aware that most people couldn't work with the silent contemplation people in the world. So they proposed, which is very similar to what transcendental meditation was at the time. He would give you a bija, a small mantra, and you would repeat the mantra to keep the thoughts from, taking away your awareness. So that, I think, is a connection with the cloud of unknowing.
And I know, Jerry, when I, at least my experiences, after I started to understanding contemplative prayer, I found that I would get the same sensation every time as I started to move towards interior silence. I would, first I would start off as if I was meditating traditionally, where there was an intended outward movement of energy. And once I started introducing my sacred word, that outward movement of energy would stop. All right. Almost to the point where I feel like it started turning around and turning inward. I would get the same picture in my mind. I get a two-dimensional black umbrella situated on top of my head, and the bottom of the umbrella goes about to where my breastbone is. And I can feel the energy start to drop down along the outsides of my body. And as it drops, it's like when snow falls, it clears all the energy out of the air, and you get a stillness. And I start to get that stillness, which I believe is the beginning of some interior silence. I guess I really don't claim to to know what I'm doing. My job is just to practice doing it. But I never had that experience, and I've had it over and over and over with centering prayer. In 40 years of dealing with at least the forms of traditional meditation I use, which was really a Zen-based format that would be tied into martial arts. I never was able to make that jump. As long as the energy was going out of the body towards the subject, I almost felt like I couldn't make the jump until that energy was captured or redirected and could be used for transformation. And I think, in my mind, that's one of the biggest things that it does. It redirects that energy, and you don't lose it. And it redirects it in a fashion to bring you deeper towards internal silence. But that's my direct experience. Maybe we can get Ananya can call up Christine Bujolta and ask her what hers is. Now that they're friends.
I was gonna say though that, no one really instructed me on meditation. I remember being told that, it'd be a good idea. That's how it started. My aunt said it would be a good idea if you started meditating. So, and I was 19 then. So there wasn't really an instruction. I didn't look anything up. I just started sitting quietly. I didn't do anything of looking at an outside object or anything like that. Perhaps I'd light some incense or something. But so much of the way I meditate is just by sitting and really being with that whole silence. So it was interesting to hear you talk about something that, I'm sitting there going, okay, well, I guess I'm doing contemplative prayer. Because that's what it is. It's this whole silence and just being in that complete silence. And of course, the more you do it, the quieter the mind becomes, to the point when you go to sit, you're in that, you're there. You're right there in that silence.
Yeah. I know in centering prayer, they recommend 2 meditation periods of 20 minutes each, one in the morning and one later on in the day, with the same approach that a lot of religions do, to keep you constantly being involved in it, to keep the energy flowing, which is, an approach used in a lot of things. And I think the Christians, they do Vespers, is that what it is? Every 6 hours. I think it's every 6 hours. They walk, at least at the monastery in Spencer, Mass, they would walk with their hands closed and saying their prayers, and they just kept doing it around the clock, to the point where you didn't know what day it was, you didn't know what time it was, you just were constantly being bathed in that type of energy.
That definitely takes you out of your body.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I know in the karate dojo I was involved in wasn't we did all the traditional things, but for whatever reason, my teacher was really into energy, meaning, he would, before he worked out, he would pray and he'd say the rosary. And by the time he was done saying the rosary, he was sweating profusely. His face was red. He only had one eye. His eye was bugging out. You physically didn't want to be in the room with him. There was that much energy coming out of him. And then he would go work out and he would do things you're not supposed to do. But I know a lot of the, in the beginning, the old karate masters, they all did that, and they would use the energy initially for striking and kicking, because in those days, that's what kept you alive. It wasn't like now. And then as time went on, they'd use it for healing and they'd use it for spiritual development. But, that's real. We studied that, and there were techniques in, he rediscovered some old techniques, and we trained on how to make energy and, how to use it wisely. And then it almost, to me, it seems that everything is all about energy movement, transformation. And we may wrap it in a certain type of description, but underneath it, to me, it's at least at this level, it's all about energy and evolving with the energy and understanding it. understanding our energy.
Question.
Yes.
Do you see a pattern, a similar pattern with the Patanjali concepts of concentration, contemplation, or dharana, dhyana, and samadhi? Isn't it very similar?
I hate to say this, but I don't know because I'm not that familiar with Patanjali. I do believe that all of the different approaches, if you take away the wrapping on them, are identical, because although there are many paths to where you're going, I do believe in the end they become one path. So you've got to make the transformations. That's about all I can comment on that, Elena. I'm just not that familiar with what his approach.
Another question I had was the strenuous thinking of Annie Besant.
Oh, wait, my head's starting to hurt.
I remember that account. Maybe Pablo Sender remembers when HPB was saying, was criticizing her because it's like the veins in her head were protruding from too much concentration.
Oh, yes, yes. And she said, don't think there, think here, or something like that.
Yes, I don't remember the whole thing, but that's what came to me with the strenuous thinking.
Yeah, she was scrunching up her head or her eyebrows or something.
Yeah, she said, you don't concentrate with your veins, dear.
Yeah, I haven't studied the secret doctrine a lot, but my times I've picked it up and everything, I always get the feeling, or the energy I feel with it is that, it's many things, but one thing it definitely is a vehicle to prepare us for, the next levels we have to go to. And I believe it's very strenuous as you're going from your lower personality to your higher, and physically strenuous. I remember watching what my teacher would go through, and what happened to his physical body before he started doing things, and then he'd get into he'd enter a different type of energy, and he would do things he's not supposed to be able to do. And then when he was done, he would go back to where he was. So I've felt that a lot of times. There were times I'd walk to the dojo, I wouldn't go in the door. I'd wait till he was done. And I sense that, I get that same sense from the secret doctrine, that it has multiple uses. But one is definitely, in my mind, a vehicle for our development. Regardless of what knowledge you're acquiring from it, that the deeper level is to transform us. I'm a young theosophist. I have a lot of learning to do.
Well, Timney had some diagrams for these stages of meditation. In one diagram, he had like a circle, and it's like you have all these objects, and the practice is you learn to stay within the circle. So your mind will go to objects everywhere outside and inside, and you just keep bringing your mind back to concentrate on whatever is in the circle. So that's the first part, the concentration part, which would probably be equivalent to centering.
Right.
And then the second part would be the contemplation, is when you have already achieved that silence of mind that can focus only within that limited sphere of the circle. So, and the third part is when all the thought drops and you're not even thinking, you're not even there anymore. And that's the part where you have union.
Mm-hmm. From my limited experience, I do believe at some point that energy has to be retained and redirected in order for it to transform you. So maybe the first step, like you're saying, then you're using your attention and that energy is going out towards some of the objects. But at some point, and maybe it's when everything disappears, that the energy has, is transforming you. It's staying within you.
And it's transforming everything that's around you as well.
Yes, because everything's connected. Yes.
That was really good, Doug. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. That's actually my first theosophical talk, so it'll take me a little while to figure out how to incorporate all the tools, the computer and notes and that type of thing. So I had fun. And I appreciate, I really appreciate sharing it with you because it really helped me. And in any way, if it can help you, then that's good.